Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the latest installment of the Conflict, Security, and Development series. I'm Laura Nettlefield, the Director of the Program in International Relations, and it is my great pleasure to introduce Tatiana Kotlyarenko today. She's the advisor on anti-trafficking issues at the OSCE ODIHR since 2016. She worked on the second edition of the National Referral Mechanisms, Joining Efforts to Protect the Rights of Trafficked Persons, a practical handbook, and addressing emerging human trafficking trends and the consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as providing technical support and capacity building to combat trafficking in human beings to OSCE participating states. In response to the ongoing armed conflict in Ukraine, which especially affects women and children, Tatiana is conducting special rapid assessment missions and providing recommendations to countries on how to prevent and address trafficking of Ukrainian women and children. She also provided testimony at a U.S. congressional hearing on protecting Ukrainian refugees from trafficking. Previously, she was the founder and executive director of the Enslavement Prevention Alliance, West Africa in Ghana. Tatiana holds an MA in Human Rights and Economic Development with honors from Columbia University and a BA from Brandeis University. Her MA thesis focused on supply and demand dynamics of sex trafficking in Russia. Tatiana has taken part in a CNN documentary titled Innocence for Sale in Cambodia, released in 2010. In her personal capacity, she assisted with responses to humanitarian crises in Afghanistan and Ukraine by organizing and supporting evacuations, as well as other activities specifically aimed at the protection of women and children. Tatiana is also a member of the 100 Women of Davos and the BMW Responsible Leaders Network. Today, she will discuss ODIHR's survey on the safety and security of women refugees from Ukraine. Thank you, Tatiana, for joining on this somber, almost first anniversary of Russia's aggression on Ukraine. And before we start, I just wanted to say a quick thank you to our other co-sponsors today, the Human Rights and Global Justice, the Center for Human Rights and Global Justice at NYU Law School, the Center for Global Affairs at NYU School for Professional Studies, the Robert L. Bernstein Institute for Human Rights, and the Office of International Programs at NYU Wagner. We'll now hand over to you. Thank you, Tatiana.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Laura. And today it is definitely a somber occasion. I just heard President Biden speaking out of my window in Warsaw. Everyone is talking about the war in Ukraine. But I would like to talk to you today about something that not everyone is talking about, but what some journalists also coined as war on women and children of Ukraine. So with that, I will share my screen, and can everyone see my screen?
I can, yes.
Okay. Because there is some sort of a glitch here. I apologize. So today I want to talk to you about what is happening to Ukrainian women and children. First, I would like to start with the background on what has been happening to Ukrainian women and children since the 1990s. In terms of trafficking specifically. Ukraine has been and remains a country of origin, transit, and destination for human trafficking. The victims of these crimes are both men, women, and children who are used for forced labor, sexual exploitation, forced to beg, and exploited for a variety of reasons, including actually surrogacy. According to IOM studies, around 300,000 Ukrainians have been victims of human trafficking since 1991 to 2022, making Ukraine one of the main countries of origin for victims of trafficking in human beings in Europe. According to some estimates, from 2019 to 2021, almost 46,000 Ukrainians fell victims to human trafficking. Around 29,000 people were trafficked out of Ukraine, but also 17,000 were trafficked inside Ukraine. Most of the victims were in the age group of 30 to 38 years old. And over 2/3 of the victims with Ukrainian citizenship were exploited in forced labor, while 30% were sexually exploited. A lot of, if we discuss the destination countries specifically for Ukrainian trafficking victims, what we see as the number one destination is specifically Russian Federation, followed by Poland and Turkey. And Ukrainian victims of trafficking have been trafficked to about 40 countries, specifically Central, Southern, and Eastern Europe. So what does it tell us is that prior to the war in Ukraine, there was a huge demand for Ukrainian trafficking victims, especially women and children. Human trafficking was already a significant issue in Ukraine prior to the escalation of conflict in 2022. From 2000, and I just wanted to give you an example. During the COVID-19 pandemic, working at ODIHR, I did a joint study together with UN Women, specifically looking at targeting of vulnerable populations during the COVID-19 pandemic. And what Ukraine has experienced specifically is targeting of children online for the production of child sexual abuse materials, as well as trafficking for other forms of sexual exploitation. All of this is happening even prior to the war because there is a huge and significant demand for Caucasian trafficking victims. So those of European descent and such, and they are at the top pyramid of the market. Now, what the conflict has done is significantly exacerbate this. And this conflict started in 2014, as we know. Even at that particular time, trafficking from Ukraine has increased significantly, both internally, affecting the population that was displaced from the eastern part of Ukraine, and also making them significantly more vulnerable to trafficking outside of Ukraine. And what I'd like to note is that human trafficking is a grave concern for refugee and displaced populations who are particularly vulnerable. According to Ukraine officials, by the end of March 2022, thousands of Ukrainians have been relocated to remote areas of Russia by Russian forces, with some being forcibly transferred. This population is highly vulnerable to trafficking, and this is something that has been released by U.S. Department of State, because we're talking about trafficking that is happening when Ukrainians are trying to cross the borders, then are in transit countries, and then countries of destination. And you're also talking about trafficking internally within Ukraine, as well as trafficking to within Russian Federation of the forcibly displaced populations. What we also know at this point is that there are over 8 million refugees from Ukraine recorded across Europe, and a significant number of internally displaced persons, which is constantly changing. And this is in comparison to formerly 16,000 Ukrainian refugees in Europe in 2015 after the 2014 conflict. What is different about this particular refugee flow is that 90% of all refugees are women and children. And the solutions that have been policy as well as practical solutions to assist this huge significant flow of refugees has not been gendered, and has not taken into account the large number of children also moving across borders. And that has created very, very significant risk. And as an example, you have a lot of Ukrainian women specifically going on different chats, whether it is Telegram, whether it is Facebook and such, putting things on there. I am traveling with my daughter and, my sister. I will be arriving here in this country. I don't know where I'm going. I don't know where I'm staying, et cetera, et cetera. And this is where a lot of vulnerability lies as well, because whoever wants to exploit them is very much able to do so, because this is a tragedy for Ukrainian women and children, but this is a huge opportunity for traffickers and criminal networks. And those criminal networks have been working from Ukraine as well as across borders, knowing that there is a significant amount of profit to be made from women and children in Ukraine. There have been many reports actually on this, and there have been many fears, but there's also been, at least on a policy level, discussions that, well, not a lot of cases are reported. We know the trafficking is potentially happening, et cetera, without real understanding of why it's not being reported. And really understanding the level of vulnerability that this population specifically is facing, and the huge level of demand, combined to that level of vulnerability. There are many reports actually, specifically looking, at these particular issues. So some are with regards to trafficking, others are in regards to a variety of different forms of exploitation. You have women who are looking for housing. You have women and children and other vulnerable people, whether it is disabled people, elderly people, people with a variety of different issues who are looking for housing. Now, a lot of the housing has been provided within households, which have been subsidized by different, government grants, etc. The problem here lies is in the fact that most of this housing hasn't been vetted. So there have been cases where women have been placed with convicted traffickers, where they've been placed in households where men are thinking that they're going to get a Ukrainian wife for a couple of months, where they will get sex, they will get household chores, all in one package. This combination also creates a lot of vulnerability for women who are then placed in very dangerous and uncomfortable situations where they're facing domestic violence, sexual harassment, potentially same for their children, and then are looking for a way out of that situation. And there are many people searching online and fishing by saying, we have a job opportunity for you, et cetera, better housing. And this is where they fall prey to particular situations of trafficking, both for labor, as well as sexual exploitation, as well as potentially for surrogacy. And there are a lot of conversations, even on a policy level, by some countries, or representatives of some countries who feel that prostitution and surrogacy are a viable form of employment for Ukrainian women. And that is hugely problematic, because if you look at the social structure within Ukraine, it's quite a traditional patriarchal society. So if women are exploited in these particular situations, as well as children, and I will discuss the findings of the survey, actually in this regard, that was conducted for Ukrainian women, specifically looking at their safety and security, these women are facing tremendous levels of violence and exploitation, as well as their children. Some of these women have escaped situations where they've already experienced sexual violence due to conflict and other forms of exploitation. They're crossing the border significantly traumatized, and many of them, and this is a very significant fact, the vast majority of Ukrainian women that are crossing have never traveled on their own. So if you can imagine a situation where you're forced to travel somewhere when you've never traveled, you are scared for your male relatives and other relatives that are left behind. You don't really have financial resources. You don't know where you're going. And there are so many volunteers to help you. The problem here has been too, is that the volunteers at the borders and other places have also not been vetted. So whilst there are many people who have been incredible in their commitment to provide assistance and support, there've also been traffickers and other exploiters in their midst. I've seen even older Ukrainian women targeted for trafficking for sexual exploitation, for example, in refugee centers. And they were lucky to escape that particular situation, for example, because they understood that something was strange when the person offering them housing, said, I could take you to country X, you just go shopping, you will live in luxury, you don't really have to do anything, etc., etc. And for these, women, they just found that whole situation rather strange. And their article upon article actually specifically talking about the very significant difficulties Ukrainians are facing, upon arrival to other countries for safety and security. And whereas there's a recognition that many countries have opened their doors to a massive amount of refugees and rather quickly, at the same time, the proper safeguards have not been put in place. And the fact that Ukrainian refugees have received within the EU 24 months temporary protection also creates some vulnerability for them, because they can be easily moved within the Schengen area without any red flags and any real checks as to what is actually happening to them. There have been many cases of uncovering sex trafficking rings preying on both women and children fleeing Ukraine. Some of these have been particularly horrific, and there have been efforts outside of just putting flyers out to do joint investigation teams, for example, by Europol, and specifically looking at the online sphere, because a lot of the initial approaches are also happening online, not just physically at border crossings, refugee centers, or various centers for registration for Ukrainian refugees, although that is also happening. And I will tell you that now, if you have a Ukrainian surname, or you're considered, to be Ukrainian, in which I have some of my staff who are Ukrainian, they're getting bombarded by offers of prostitution, surrogacy, or something that looks like a job that ends up being an offer of prostitution. The other big issue I wanted to discuss with you today is the forced deportation of hundreds of thousands of children to the Russian Federation, because that also not just falls potentially under the Genocide Convention, but that also is a form of trafficking of children. At this point, and I'm sure some of you have seen this in the news, there have been consistent reports of children from orphanages being moved across the Russian Federation. Children who do have parents as well, infiltration camps being separated from their parents and then moved to other locations. Children who have been forcibly evacuated from eastern Ukraine, etc. And what is going on in Russian Federation now is really quite worrisome, because they've changed their legislation to fast-track adoptions. And what is happening is that the identity of the child is being changed, their name, their birth date, as well as their citizenship, which makes it almost impossible at a certain point to return this child to Ukraine, but to reunify this child with their family. Or to locate this child whatsoever. There are many Ukrainian parents who are searching for their children. There's been a case actually filed at the ICC against the Russian Ombudsman for Children, who's been promoting this. There are very few solutions actually in place outside of a few civil society initiatives in trying to get some of the children back from Russian Federation who do have parents with legal parental rights. But these are very, very minor. And this is going to turn into a very significant issue long-term on how to locate and reunite these children and return them to Ukraine. And I just want to read you an example from an Amnesty International report. In order not to draw a lot of attention, I took a bus from Kiev. I went from there to Lithuania, then to Latvia. In Latvia, I crossed the border with Russia on foot. There was another bus there that took me to Donetsk. Overall, the journey was about 4,000 kilometers one way. It took me 3 days to get from Kiev to Donetsk. And then there was the same route back with the boys. The procedure has to go as unnoticed as possible. It's not an easy trip. For one person to follow the route one way, it costs 350 euros. A few NGOs provided me with the money for this. This is how it was possible. So even in situations where parents are able to or willing to make the trip, where they potentially face the possibility of being put into a filtration camp or not returning themselves, the journey is actually quite costly. And from what I understand now, it's very hard to cross the borders, and a lot of the borders are blocked up. So it becomes very, very difficult, even if they do get their children to return back. If we just talk about last fall, out of hundreds of thousands of children that have been reported, and it was something alongside 346,000 children who are forcibly deported to the Russian Federation, only 96 children have been returned to Ukraine. So that just really provides the significance of this. The other piece that is important to note is that children are also being used in the armed conflict. And when we talk about Eastern Ukraine and the conflict that started in 2014, there have been verified reports that children have been used for the purposes of armed conflict in a variety of different ways. And that is also something that falls within the human trafficking definition. So now I would like to talk a little bit about the work that ODIHR has done on the survey. So whilst there are many different reports that specifically talked about what was going on and what should be done, no one actually asked the Ukrainian refugees themselves, specifically women, about their situation and what it is they're facing. So in August last year, ODIHR launched a survey specifically aimed at Ukrainian refugee women to really understand a couple of different things. Their vulnerability to trafficking, as well as what they're experiencing overall. And if we did a survey specifically on trafficking, we would have not gotten responses. But a survey on safety and security actually has gotten us about 1,000 responses within a month that the survey was up. And the aim of the survey was to provide insights into the lived experiences, concerns, and challenges that women refugees face, and provide key recommendations on accommodation, employment, registration issues, as well as capacity building for those who work with refugees. And to date, actually, we have trained over 100 frontline responders, and next month we will be training about 75 more. So with that, I would like to discuss the survey findings. So about 29% of the responders were 18 to 34 years old, 58% of responders were 35 to 50, and 1% of responders were 60 plus. And what this also tells us is that a lot of the older Ukrainian women do not use the internet as much, but two, that you had the significant number of women specifically who are generally who have children. You know, if you look at the Ukrainian context, this 58%. So what are the issues that they face in transit or destination countries? More than 3 in 5 had insufficient knowledge of the local language. Nearly 1 in 2 lacked financial resources. 1 in 3 were unable to rent accommodation because in many countries, whilst government subsidized housing in a household was supported, there was also a lot of discrimination in renting housing to refugees. 1 in 6 lacked access to healthcare. More than 1 in 6 lacked social networks and community. 1 in 50 faced domestic violence. 1 in 50 discrimination. 1 in 8 experienced fraud. 1 in 20 received threats. 1 in 33 experienced blackmail or coercion. And these are significant numbers because if we're talking about approximately 8 million people, we are talking about large numbers of women and children who have experienced these particular issues. Almost 3/4 also received no legal assistance or offers of support for legal guidance, even though they were making significant decisions about their future and that of their children. Over half were not sufficiently informed about their rights in a way that they could understand. And I will give you an example. I've seen some of these pamphlets in a number of countries I visited. And honestly speaking, unless you're a lawyer, it would be very, very difficult to navigate these pamphlets or websites and such. So this is why they went for advice guidance online, which made them even more vulnerable. And 4 in 10 were not made aware of the risks of human trafficking. In addition, 1 in 22 Ukrainian women who responded to the survey experienced sexual harassment. As I mentioned, more than 1 in 50 domestic violence, 1 in 50 requests for sexual favors, 1 in 100 received proposals to work in the sex industry, 1 in 250 received offers of surrogacy, 1 in 250 received proposals to produce pornographic material, 1 in 500 have experienced sexual violence, and here we're talking about rape. What was the situation of their children? Because we also had a number of questions specifically asking them about what their children are facing. 1 in 33, bullying, discrimination, or harassment in schools, universities, or the local community. What is important to note here is that a lot of Ukrainian children to date, 1 year on, are not able to gain entrance to schools or kindergartens, which also places a significant burden on the women in terms of finding employment or proper childcare for these children, or these children are left alone. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, many children were targeted online by traffickers or those looking to produce child sexual abuse materials of them. And now these children have moved, they're even more vulnerable and unattended. So that's a major risk. 1 in 100 children are facing domestic violence, 1 in 200 sexual harassment, 1 in 250 requests for sexual favors, 1 in 500 receive proposals to produce pornographic materials. So these issues are really, really significant. So what did the women say that they really, really need? Access to safe accommodation. That has been one of the priorities actually for the survey respondents, but as well as those that we have interviewed across a number of different countries, safe accommodation is really, really needed. And oftentimes, a lot of vulnerability is created in the search of safe accommodation, and many Ukrainian refugees return back to Ukraine, at least over the summer months and the fall months, because they were not able to access safe accommodation. Need for clearer information about their rights and status in a hosting country, because there's also a lot of confusion in that regard. Access to healthcare and psychological services, as I've also mentioned, one of the issues that they're dealing with is significant trauma. Access to psychological services is key. Access to employment referral services, and that's also another important piece. And here we need to say that safe employment services, because one of the things that has also happened in many countries that have taken in Ukrainian refugees, they're being used as cheap labor and often in exploitative conditions, where employment agencies have decided that or know that women need accommodation. So they've rented all the cheap accommodation, and then women are forced to work for next to nothing in horrid conditions in these accommodations. Language courses, legal services, and financial support. We have also created a set of recommendations for states, which include one on accommodation, which is establishing vetting procedures for accommodation providers. As I said, we cannot actually pretend that we're providing safety to refugees if they're put into accommodations where they're likely to experience violence, sexual exploitation, labor exploitation, etc. In terms of employment, regulate employment agencies to prevent trafficking. Increase labor inspections to identify trafficking for the purpose of labor exploitation. In terms of information, monitor and remove online disinformation about Ukrainian refugees, including hate speech. And we have seen quite a bit of that now, where there's a lot of economic hardship in many countries across the EU and outside of EU. So a lot of this is now being turned against Ukrainians as well. Provide awareness raising information both in Ukrainian and Russian at key locations. And once again, I've mentioned before that Ukrainians are not reporting trafficking and exploitation cases, but there's also an explanation to this. If you have now significant percentages of population in a number of different countries which are Ukrainian or Russian speaking, and if they call an emergency line, say 911 in US, and no one can respond to them in a language that they understand, or just hang up on them because there's no one to answer in a language that they understand, that poses a significant issue with reporting of crimes committed against Ukrainian refugees, and also provision of information on rights in easy to understand language. The other part, in terms of identification, is also provision of trainings to law enforcement at national and local levels, as well as training of stakeholders working with refugees. So within my work at ODIHR, we've been doing that, but what we have realized is that a lot of times in a number of different countries, there are also stigmas that are attached to Ukrainian women refugees, specifically based on the issues I mentioned before. You had hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian refugees that were trafficked. There's a presumption that a Ukrainian woman in prostitution actually is there for her own free will, not being exploited because of these stereotype stigmas and such that are attached to this. And this brings me to a very important point, which is addressing demand. Addressing demand specifically for sexual and labor exploitation of Ukrainian women and children. Because otherwise it's putting a band-aid on it, identifying trafficking victims here and there and such, without actually creating real policy to address demand that fosters and fuels exploitation of these very, very vulnerable people. And when it comes to children, and this has not really been done in a comprehensive way to date, set up a robust system for all unaccompanied and separated children. Um, it, it's really concerning that children crossing borders, especially at the beginning of the conflict, were just disappearing. Um, as the war actually continued, there have been more safeguards put in place, but there's no proper registration system that has been created to date for unaccompanied and separated children that actually tracks them from the point of departure identification throughout their journey to where they're staying and where they're moving from there, etc. As well as appointment of legal guardians who are monitored within 24 hours and conducting best interest of the child assessment, meaning really trying to understand what this child needs and how to best safeguard this child. And the other important bit is addressing vulnerabilities of Ukrainian children to exploitation for the production of child sexual abuse materials and other forms of sexual exploitation online. These children are extremely, extremely vulnerable to this form of exploitation. And with that, I would actually like to talk to you a little bit about a handbook that Laura mentioned that I produced with ODIHR and some of the top global experts on trafficking, on trauma, etc., as well as with inputs from survivor leaders, which is the National Referral Mechanism Handbook. This handbook is a compendium of everything you could possibly need, working with victims of trafficking, but also working with victims of gender-based violence and other forms of violence. It has a significant amount of information on interviewing techniques, which you might find helpful in your work, which are trauma-informed and victim-centered. It has information on different criminal justice procedures, as well as identification of migrants, refugees, etc. So I strongly suggest that you actually take a look at the handbook. And then I wanted to also invite you to join us on March 8th during the Commission on the Status of Women, where at the UN, we will be holding an event specifically looking at technology as both assisting in combating trafficking in human beings, but also creating vulnerabilities to trafficking in human beings, especially in conflict and crisis situations. The keynote speaker will be Theresa May, and I think that you may find the event interesting. So with that, I will hand over back to Laura for our Q&A.